Thank you. Okay, a lot of ground to cover tonight because we have a little bit broader theme as we're at the end here, okay? And we're going to talk about, we left off in our last lecture talking about the situation in 1848, and it looked like the complete collapse of the Congress of Vienna and its goal to maintain the status quo in Europe, to maintain the balance of power, to kind of keep some kind of balance of power. Tonight we're going to kind of shatter that, and we're going to really bring the exodus of Europe, as unfortunately Europe in the 20th century will manage to eat itself and never quite recover. The first thing that comes up, like right after the restoration of order after 1848, is the Crimean War. And the only thing really to remember about the Crimean War is probably that it is in many ways a glimpse into what modern war is going to look like. For those of you who have a degree of familiarity perhaps with the American Civil War, it's only worth noting that there's nothing going on in the American Civil War that wasn't happening in the Crimean War. Matter of fact, in the Crimean they actually discussed using chemical weapons. In the Crimea you have the first newspaper correspondence bringing regular events and things like that back to people. It's not just soldiers' letters from home. Actually broad-based media coverage of a conflict. It's also an interesting conflict in only that it is one of those things that made us suddenly realize that even though the Russians have this extraordinary advantage of 11 time zones, one of good old boys, and he never ever possibly thought that they would deviate from the good old boys club, and in fact they did. And there was a very clear message sent to the Russians that the Russians are not going to have the Ottoman Turkish Empire when it does fall, and that they should abandon that hope, because the rest of the Western European powers are just, that's not going to sit well at all. That would be unacceptable. That would just give way too much to the Russians. And in the Crimean War, basically the Russians are beaten, and they were fighting pretty much everybody, and they liberate their serfs in 1861. And that was kind of that was certainly a good move, but it really was still a pretty bad situation for most people in Russia, and the poverty was we could argue it still is today. So the next thing about is basically the forces of nationalism appear to be effectively suppressed, the status quo appears to be effectively maintained, and of course the balance of power. And then we have that dichotomy of Italian and German unification when a new sheriff is in town in France, and that's going to be Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who's now Napoleon III. And through a series of secret meetings and diplomatic blunders, he is going to basically open the door for a new Italian state to take place under the very wise leadership of Camillo de Cavour, who served Victor Emmanuel II as a brilliant prime minister, restructuring after their humiliation in 1848 and their sound defeat to the Austrians. The Sardinians are going to be the driver of Italian unification, and Sardinia is the focus of all their revolutionary hopes, and eventually they're going to be successful, but with a lot of help. I still maintain, and I don't think that's necessarily important to know on an essay, but I don't think there's any other heritage that anyone can claim with more pride than the Italians. When you consider the legacies of Rome, Caesar, you think of Michelangelo and Da Vinci and the Renaissance and the formation of the Vatican, and no one can make those kind of claims. So you have to, at some level, as a student of European history, kind of understand Italian nationalism and say, yeah, there seems like there would be a real drive for the Italians to want to have their own state. And that will only take place because the other countries that controlled Italy for so long, those being the Austrians and the French, the Spanish were driven out by Garibaldi in 1860, and by as well. This is through external or outside events, and that's a nice way to bring in Bismarck and the Prussians, who you look at Bismarck, Chancellor of Prussia, Cavour, Prime Minister of Sardinia, later Italy. They both kind of have the same goal. It's a great case study in understanding political brinksmanship and also knowing that those two had a common goal. And for Italy, it was Italian unification, and for Prussia, it was German unification. And the way to do that is to find a way to weaken both Austria and France. And they both kind of worked to that end. When you think about it, they did it very cautiously. Well, I think Cavour was cautious. I think Bismarck was rather risky. He played that heist with the rest of Europe. Just a couple words about Bismarck, because I think that they could ask you something on this particular period. The post-Napoleonic European period has been very popular in the last couple years for free response essay questions. Bismarck is a unique political figure. We would have to probably go all the way back to Cardinal Richelieu to get someone that's as similar of a political creature as Bismarck. In most normal, rational states of affairs between countries, and I'm talking about at the policy-making level, typically they like to settle things as peacefully as possible. In other words, what I'm getting to is what Clausewitz said in Domkrieg, is that war or physical violence or organized sanctioned physical of most countries, and with Bismarck, it was his first. It was his trump card, and he played it extraordinarily well. I think there's a tremendous moment here where you can think about this and wonder if Bismarck is the best thing for Germany or if he's the worst thing for Germany. Because he is the best thing for Germany, because I don't think Prussia is able to unite Germany without him. But he's also bad for Germany because both Kaiser Wilhelm II and Hitler are going to think of themselves as modern-day Bismarcks. And they're clearly not. And the reason we know that is because when you study Bismarck, you realize something. Call him a high-stakes poker player, whatever he is. But Bismarck is able to completely isolate all the countries that he wants to basically have a fight with. Wilhelm II and Hitler can never do that. Germany is always taking on more and more and more and more and getting into bad alliances. And Bismarck is always very, very careful to make sure that he's dealing with only Denmark. Only Denmark. And he invites Austria to go in with him, and he observes the Austrians. And then he attacks the Austrians in the 7 Weeks' War. And the French. And he knows the Ottoman Turk is always in the southern border of Austria. So, you know, when you fight Austria, you're never really fighting the whole Austrian army, because they're always going to have to keep a significant portion of their army on their southern border with the threat of the Ottoman Turks. And you add Italy to that and Cavour, now you're splitting their army into third to defeat the larger Austrian army. Brilliant. Dangerous? It's incredibly dangerous. But it worked. And then he comes back and, of course, tricks the southern German states with a year-old Ems telegram and precipitates that one. So there's this degree. It's incredibly put together, and how he's able to do this. You're not Napoleon. You're wasting your time in the sense that you can't follow the same Napoleon. And that's a lot about the conditions and a lot of other variables. So anyway, interesting creature, Bismarck. And so he's really the driving force for both Italian and German unity. What does it mean to us? As students of European history, that means now the Congress of Vienna is still kind of muddling away. Balance of power is toast after 1871, because when we look at Germany in 1871, we see a Germany has an economy that is 1/100th the size of the British economy, and by 1914 it'll second industrial. It's Gottlieb Daimler and Carl Benz that are coming up with the first automobile that Henry Ford is going to put on an assembly line. And it's the Germans that are really doing a lot of amazing things with their industrial potential. This is big, and this of course is kind of the elephant in the room now. After 1871 up until 1914, Germany is becoming the elephant in the room, because if you really, really think you're the Brit, Germany's going, and that's exactly why the British are going to get into an arms race with Germany on the run-up to World War I, because the British Navy kind of panicked and they realized that the German Kriegsmarine was approaching the same size, and you know, the British kind of went into panic mode a little bit late and a little bit out of kilter for what they really should have done. We'll get to that when we get down here to World War I. It's occurring at this time. Of course, intellectual history is a study. It doesn't really fit into a century. It's ongoing. It's like the Enlightenment. It's like these other movements. They're ongoing. But when we're talking about intellectual history of especially the period 1850 up until 20th century, we're really talking about the change in philosophy from the Enlightenment period into what we call the German school. So remember, in terms of philosophy, you have three major schools of study. You have the Greek school, which is really the Greeks and Cicero and the Romans and all the really old stuff. And then you bring in that next phase, which is the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment focuses so much on how man should be governed and fundamental rights and natural law and all that stuff. And now we're into what we call the German school. So you have a Greek, you have a French, and now you have a German school of philosophical thought. And that's going to be Immanuel Kant, that's going to be Hegel, later Marx, and Kierkegaard, and you get into the surrealists, and that'll branch off into some French with Sartre and among others. So what we're really looking at is we want to be able to understand that this particular German school is taking a different look than what the French did, than what the Greeks did, in that they're beginning to look at power and how, not just how man should be governed, but ultimately how power is acquired and how one defines oneself. And so we kind of, and again, because of surrealism and stuff that happens after World War I, obviously it broadens a great deal. But you want to think about influential people like Nietzsche. You want to think about influential people like Kipling. And you want to think about how they viewed the world and how they began to explain this idea, which is new imperialism. New imperialism is decidedly nasty. It's a lot nastier than old imperialism. Old imperialism had that kind of anthropological flair to it, where you're thinking about Marco Polo, and you're thinking about Vespucci, and you're thinking about people that there was exploitation in the time of Cortez and the Spanish were always, labeled as the bad guy of old imperialism. But there was still a degree to which people wanted to interact, and they wanted to learn languages, and they wanted to have a certain degree of exchange of new foods and spices and ideas, and there was this opening up. In the second imperialism, the new imperialism, what we call in the 19th century, it's a lot more about control. It's about controlling markets. It's more of an economic expediency and an economic movement than an anthropological, hey, let's learn each other's languages. Wow, yeah, I can exploit stuff from you. I can get your gold. I can take your things. This one is more about economic control, establishing things called protectorates. This is something that the British are going to master, and they're going to be extraordinarily successful in Africa, in China, in India, and that's where they're, of course, going to say, the sun never sets on the British crown. And a big reason why, I would argue, we still study European history today, and why just about everywhere you go, certainly on this side of the world, a European language is spoken. So, this is where that real impact comes in. And a lot of this is timing. The world is depth presence there to capitalize on that. And that's kind of what new imperialism is. So, we look down the dynamic. 4,000 years of tradition is wiped out. Now, not just said they would have. They're probably right, sadly enough. But we know that they're able to bring down that entire system and establish China as a protectorate and exploit China and get all their silver back and get everything else back. That's not drawing right or wrong. Those are just the facts. Matter of fact, there's a good argument for both sides on right and wrong. But the point is that this is pretty nasty. And that's how it separates itself from old imperialism. That new imperialism is definitely going to be different and has that racist kind of flair to it. And if we're dealing with racism at this part in history, we're really setting the table for this part of history right here. Okay, so we really set, but that's where the seeds are really planted in this period with Nietzsche and with Wagner and Houston Stewart Chamberlain and Mr. Social Darwinism, Herbert Spencer. These are the people that are really bringing in some pretty dark stuff here. Okay, so we've got intellectual history, we've got economic history, we've got political diplomatic history, we've got military history, and looky what happens. We're coming back again to military history with the First World War. And the First World War is a great opportunity for you because I think this is a topic that they do like to select, and it's really the end of innocence. I'd like to say that the lessons, here's the warning signs here, but they were pretty much ignored. And in this war, they're going all the way back to 1815, and they're using Napoleon's playbook with the Schlieffen Plan and with their mindset. And unfortunately, you know this, because these things have happened. Because these things happened, and you've got Germans testing things like needle gun way back in the Danish War in the 1860s. You've got belt-fed, crew-served automatic weapons meeting Napoleonic tactics. There's the best dressed guy in the house. You've got some real problems coming with World War I. Okay, I would say as a general idea, first of all, they're not going to ask you anything military on World War I. I know that sounds kind of like, well, why wouldn't it? They're not going to. They're not going to ask you about Verdun. They're not going to ask you about Ypres. They're not going to ask you about naval war. They're not going to ask you about. They may possibly ask you about technology. Well, there it is, right? This is why World War I is such a great collision of the old way of doing things and the Napoleonic way of doing things. Why did 9 million boys get slaughtered and nothing really happened in World War I? Of course, they thought it was the war to end all war. They thought it was going to be wonderful, right? They're cheering in every city. There hasn't been a really good war since Napoleon. It's been almost 100 years. That's what we need. That'll fix everything. Just a good old war. And it'll be over by Christmas. Nikki? No, because it wasn't big enough. You know, it wasn't a mass mobilization like Napoleon was. You know, it was still pretty limited. It was out in the periphery. We can read about it in the paper. But as far as really connecting to the whole war effort, it's got to happen in Rome. It's got to happen in Berlin. It's got to happen in London. It's got to happen in Paris. It's got to happen in St. Petersburg. Vienna, all these cities, all these young guys are signing up. Everybody's getting the same exact propaganda. It's going to be quick. It's going to be wonderful. This is going to be the last war to end all wars, and it'll be over by Christmas. They were about right, just 4 years off. It was over by Christmas 1918, not 1914. But what we know about it is, and what I think you want to be thinking about if you decide to pick an essay on it tomorrow, is that World War I is really the end of the Romantic period. It's the end of this notion that, you know, putting on a really cool uniform and looking good and marching straight and being in a nice clean line and being able to bounce a quarter off your bed is going to make you a great successful fighter. And that war is just still something that's got a great deal of honor and glory to it, and it's going to, this is all going to be shattered, absolutely, completely destroyed. And those original guys that signed up in 1914 are quickly made into ghosts. They're just gone. Where do they go? They vaporize on the battlefield. We start getting unknowns. We get pieces of human beings we can't even identify. So we have to form tombs of unknown soldiers in all the countries that fought, because we can't even identify these boys. And then, of course, there are the ones that are shell-shocked. New phenomenon, because for the first time, technology is bringing war 24 hours a day. You're not going to get to sit around the campfire at night and decompress from the horrible things that you saw or had to do the day of the battle. Now, warfare is never-ending. The shells are relentless. You have flares going. You have electricity. You have the war is just now just a constant barrage on the mind. And so the damage to the human mind and the human psyche is so extraordinary, because you go in with this romantic notion, and romance is now destroyed completely. And in this whole generation of World War I, young people, not just the men, but everyone, the rug is completely pulled out from under them. The rug of romanticism is pulled out from that whole generation. And that's why you see the results of World War I. This is the part I think they just don't teach well enough, is that World War I is a huge event psychologically to the world. It shakes us out of the innocence. It forces us to recognize the role that technology plays in changing everything. Everything is different now. And that's why you see people adopting a degree and attitude in what we call in this country the Roaring '20s, but in the post-World War I period, where it's like, life can be over in a second. Why even fight it? It's like, there is no romance. There is no wonderful thing to look forward to. This is going to be terrible. We should enjoy it now. I'm going to kill it or spring. I'm going to try to get him. He's on the glass.
That's not fly. That's a bee.
That's a belly. Yeah. He's coming in from the hallway. Anybody allergic to bees? Okay. It's for terrorists, but I'll use it. Okay. So, all right, we have. You notice I haven't talked much about the war because there's no reason to talk about the war, but there is reason to talk about the loss of Romanticism and the impression that the war brings and the devastation that the war brings psychologically and intellectually, because as we get on the other side of World War I, you have horrible political and diplomatic realities, and that's going to be the situation with the just the way Versailles went. I mean, they never really attempted to solve the problems that started World War I. Everybody just kind of said, hey, we're all too tired. We're beaten to a pulp, let's just stop fighting. And so they did. But they never really solved Balkan nationalism. They never really dealt with some of the problems. And of course, they're just going to fester, and you throw economic depression on top of that, and oh, what a big surprise. We're back, fighting in much worse conditions later. Okay, so this is where we are. We're looking at this period, this interwar period, this period that I would refer to as 1917 and 1939. But one of the events that we kind of have to squeeze into this, which always kind of is awkwardly placed, is the Russian Revolution. Okay, so that kind of, it's kind of here, and it's kind of here, and it's kind of here, and then it's kind of here, and then it's definitely flopping and falling to hell there, and so anyway. I have to keep myself really reined in here, okay? Really reined in, all right? So let's start with a nice compare and contrast the Russian Revolution with the French Revolution. Does anyone want to throw out anything about when you want to think about really big picture stuff, like if you were asked on the exam to look at revolution and look at similarities and differences? Tom, what do you think?
Lack of food in both instances.
Yeah, you've got human suffering and hardship, a degree to which has to be one of those things that's a catalyst of a revolution in almost every case. If your belly's full, you're not likely to revolt. That's pretty honest. What else?
So Russian Revolution is led by peasants, whereas the French Revolution is led by the middle class.
Okay, good. I think that's an important piece. When you can roll out the word bourgeoisie and spell it best you can, and point out that the French Revolution is really a bourgeois-led, driven revolution. It really is unique in history in that regard. And while the Russian Revolution, be careful here, the Russian Revolution is a peasant revolution. Peasants that are led by intellectual, full-blown, Marxist, wacko revolutionaries. Okay? And Trotsky's even crazier than Lenin. But the point is that yes, you have Russia as a peasant-based society. I mean, just stop and think about it for a minute. Just stop and think about it. If you're going to do anything with the Russian Revolution at all, it would be so cool if you could articulate just a little bit about the fact that Karl Marx never saw his idea of revolution for Russia. Oh, they were feudal. Yeah, it's hard. They just came out of feudalism in 1861. So, they went from feudalism all the way over. Marx always said his revolution would be what countries? Germany and Britain. Those are the countries because they had the most developed industrial sector. They had the most stuff, and capitalism was thriving there. What capitalism is there in Russia? It actually worked out pretty well for a while because it took everybody from being equally poor to equally poor. So really, it wasn't a huge shock to their society at all. Just you had to kill off a whole bunch of successful people, which we don't tend to think is the best way to really bring about reform. Find your best and brightest and kill them. But that was the recipe for finding equality. We're just going to lower the bar instead of what Marx wanted to do, which is raise it. You have a degree of improvement to life, not degradation and suffering. But we're talking about Russia. Okay, so French Revolution, bourgeois-led, huge middle class. Peasants are kind of put into that middle class because of the structure of the Estates General and the fact you've got that gigantic, dare I say, plurality of the population. What, 98% are all lumped into that one class. That was a natural shift to that National Assembly. Not so much with Russia. Russia's had revolutionary uprisings before. You had a revolt in 1825, the Decembrist revolt. You had another one in 1905. Looked like, at least Lenin thought, he missed the opportunity because he's still suffering in Switzerland and missed the great 1905 revolt, which was put down and smashed and no effect. The difference in 1917 is the war. The war. When you're dealing with a modern day army where you only have the industrial capacity to send your soldier to the front line with a single shot weapon, bolt action with one bullet chambered in it, you're not going to do well against another army with a crew-served, belt-fed, fully automatic weapon. That is not a good place to be in. And they'll do it in World War I, and they'll also do it in World War II. But in World War I, it is the beginning of the breakdown because they are so far behind the power curve in a war that really is important about technology, and especially because the Germans don't have, the Russians are fighting the JV team of the German army. I mean, these guys they put on the Eastern Front, this is like 30% of their force, and they're there just to hold ground because the Schlieffen Plan called for what? A quick defeat of the French, and then move those forces to the east and fight the Russians. So those guys in the Eastern Front, we're told, we're just waiting. We're just waiting. Kill as many Russians as you can. They're going to keep coming at us. First with rifles, and then with knives and bayonets, and then with sticks, and then with rakes, and just keep shooting them and just keep killing them. And eventually, there's a wearing down in the Russian army to the point where finally the Tsar has lost all of his credibility. And to the guy's defense, he came out to the front for Christmas 1916. Really a kind-hearted gesture. I mean, I think his heart is in the right place, but certainly his advisors and his diplomatic brain is left at home because he needed to take care of the problems at home and not go to the front. But he went to the front, and when he went to the front, that leaves his wife and Captain Crazy Rasputin kind of running amok. And it's a hee-haw story, but it's tragic as all get out. And ultimately, the Duma under Alexander Kerensky takes a vote of no confidence. Okay, now please, at this point, remember there are two Russian revolutions, and they are distinct. Remember, we have a February Revolution. Here is a trap. Don't fall into the trap tomorrow. If you're going to write about the Russian Revolution, make sure you articulate on your essay that you understand that Lenin just didn't all of a sudden come to power. And then you start talking about Stalin. You've got to get Kerensky in there and that the February Revolution, and talk about what they wanted to do because you don't have Lenin and the Bolsheviks come to power if you don't have Kerensky talking about democracy. Democracy inherently brings in different political groups, and they have a degree of freedom to talk. Without that, there would have been Tsarist repression just like 1905. So the reason the 1917 revolution succeeds is that Kerensky is going to take power in February of 1917. Kerensky's big flaw is not democracy. It would have been a real interesting proposition for a country that never had it, kind of like Iraq today. But his problem is, they stayed in the war. He didn't get the big picture. He was trying to do everything. Try to start a democracy, be kind to the Tsar, keep the Tsar in the nice little dacha, and take care of the royal family, and try to coordinate the war effort, and try to bring about reform through the government. And you know how it is to try to get in through our Congress. You're trying to work with all these individuals and pass laws and do things, and he just couldn't get it done fast enough. And there's Lenin. Peace, bread, land. Simple slogan. Keep hammering it, keep hammering it, keep hammering it. And what do people really want? In World War I, in Russia, in 1917? Peace. Bring the boys home. Bring the boys home. Famine? Yeah, never popular, right? And are you kidding me? Land? You're talking about land reform? You want to get people's attention real quick in a society that's been in feudalism? Land reform? This is like, Lenin is like a lottery ticket. People can't believe it. Of course, not for the upper class. But what percentage are they? Land? You're talking about land reform? You want to get people's attention real quick in a society that's been in feudalism? Land reform? This is like, Lenin is like a lottery ticket. People can't believe it. Of course, not for the upper class. But what percentage are they? 1? You know, army officers. Yeah, so you end up with Kerensky being pretty much run out on a rail. You know, run out on a cruiser called Aurora that threatened to blow him away. He gets away, comes to America. Thank you very much. Lenin takes over. Trotsky's there. But it's not easy for him, is it? Don't forget that next piece. Don't forget the next piece, which is the Civil War from 1917 to 1920. It wasn't a bed of roses for Lenin. Those guys had a tough road to hoe. Remember, they've got to first get that crazy guy Trotsky to Brest-Litovsk and negotiate that war and get out of the war. He's got to deliver on his political promise. Peace has to come. And Trotsky just about completely gummed up the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk because of his Ukrainian Jewish roots. But eventually, he got it done. And Russia gets out of the war. A little bit too early, right? Because they're not going to get anything. They're on the right side of the war, but they're going to get out. They get nothing from Versailles.
Did they get their land back from
They got Ukraine. They did reclaim Ukrainian land that they lost at Brest-Litovsk. So they did get something, but I think they just took it because it was being fought over in the Civil War, and Czech soldiers were coming into that area, and Polish soldiers were coming into that area. So it was kind of a, you know, once again, just like we know today in the news. I mean, it's got to be hard to live in Ukraine. It's just, you know, there's so much that's happened there over time. It's really, really tough. Okay, so Lenin is in charge, and gee, where do we go with the Russian Revolution? They're going to fight from 1917 to 1920. They're going to finally, the dust is going to settle in 1920. It's the beginning of the Soviet Union. We know that what was Petersburg, that was Petrograd, is now going to be Leningrad, which is now again Petersburg. And things start looking better. For the first time in Russian history in how long, things really start looking better because Lenin realizes that he has to take one step back in order to take 2 steps forward. So if your goal is communism and you're on the continuum and you've jumped to socialism from feudalism, Lenin is going to launch the New Economic Policy, or NEP, which is basically to say we've got to take one step back and have some capitalism because we need some surpluses. We need people to be able to produce a surplus of food. And it worked. Independent incentives. It created a whole new class. For the first time in Russian history, you start to see the kulaks rise up, a true middle class of successful, hardworking, ambitious farmers. And I'd say let the good times roll. Government quota? Yes. But after the government quota, keep your surpluses, sell them for profit, and begin to buy products for yourself and your family. Things started getting better in Russia. And then, well, the worst possible thing happens. Lenin has a stroke. Lenin's health deteriorates. And we know what's coming. Lenin's going to have a second stroke in the second year. That's going to be fatal. And even though he tried to warn everybody of Stalin, you know what's coming. And of course, Stalin's going to come in by criticizing Trotsky and discrediting Trotsky because Trotsky was too crazy, too much of a revolutionary, even though Trotsky was clearly picked to be number 2 man. He's been there the whole time. Trotsky's going to be ousted by Stalin. It's a nice way of saying it. And Stalin's going to undo NEP right away. So he's going to start practicing socialism in one country. We'll see you. And that leads to the really, really tough times that are coming, and those are the 5-year plans. And of course, it's going to be forced. First thing is agricultural collectivization in the first one, then forced industrialization. We're going to create an artificial industrial revolution. And they did actually produce a whole lot of steel, but no consumer goods and more suffering and hardship for the people of Russia in the Soviet times. So I think that's an important interwar piece. Meanwhile, while all that is going on, in Western Europe, you've got bad economic depression. We suffered, of course, in the United States as well, but not on the same scale, at least in the scale of hyperinflation. We had deflation here. They had hyperinflation in Germany because of the war reparations and the unsteady markets and things like that. As you know, by the end of the 1920s, into the 1930s, things had pretty much collapsed worldwide. Once depression starts, you can't stop it. Markets are always globally linked. You can't just, well, let's just keep it in Greece. Problems are in Greece. Problems are in Portugal. Problems in Italy. That's their problem. Let's not worry about it. We have to be concerned. We are all connected. It's true today. It was true then. So this is where you get to, and one of the guys I really credit is George Marshall from the Cold War, because I think Marshall's plan for rebuilding Europe after World War II was still really brilliant. In other words, economic stability leads to political stability. Our goal, everybody's foreign policy goal, except for Mr. Putin, is political stability. The only government in the world that wants political instability are the Russians. And that's only because, what?
Maybe Iran.
Yeah, again, because they're an oil-producing country. Remember, when you have worldwide political instability, oil prices go up because people panic. Those oil prices jump immediately. As soon as something bad happens, oil prices go up, and that's profiting the economies of the oil-producing countries. So they benefit and directly profit from world instability. That's kind of where I was going there. So anyway, we know that this is the real catalyst for really bad things to happen. This is why we should be extraordinarily careful and mindful in keeping up and reading and thinking today, because we're real close. We've teetered on depression a couple times, and I'm not real comfortable with quantitative easing and things like that. But this was so bad that it brought. You're always going to find apathy with people, and we're talking about fascist Italy or fascist Spain or National Socialist Germany. When there is time of true hard depression, you see more and more people become apathetic toward government. You're always going to see people be apathetic toward government. Whether a person is just doesn't vote, never voted, don't believe in it, doesn't matter, my vote doesn't count. Study a little political science, you might change your mind. But when you start seeing more and more and more people, like a greater and greater percentage of a population, become politically apathetic, that's when things get really dangerous. And that's why Marshall's getting back to economic instability leads to political instability. And a simple way to think about the rise of totalitarianism and Mussolini and Hitler and Franco and Stalin to a lesser degree, but still Stalin as well as a totalitarian leader, is when people begin to say it can't get any worse. Like, it is so bad right now, it can't get any worse. Let's go way out in left field and try something really different. That's when the red flags go up. That's how you end up with a Hitler. That's how you end up with a Mussolini. That's how you end up with these people feeding back into this train of philosophic thought that there are people that are racially and biologically superior or inferior, and it is our task, because we are Italians and the blood of Julius Caesar courses through our veins, we are biologically better than everybody else, and it is our destiny to recreate Rome. And because Hitler and National Socialism is going to refer to the Slavs as the mongrel race and refer to Jews as vermin, they are going to believe that they are racially and biologically superior to anybody other than themselves. And don't stop there, because at the same time the Japanese are doing the same thing. And to some extent still do today. Some parts of Japan. Definite, that has not gone away in Japan. Okay? So that gets at the root of this thing that is kind of like the third rail. There's no reason for me to go into this. We know that we're not speaking German, so we know how that ended. Okay. So we look at the cleanup afterward, and the cleanup afterward, of course, is that period we call the Cold War, 1945 to 1991. By the way, Stalin was Time Magazine's Man of the Year, Hitler was Time Magazine's Man of the Year, and kind of like studying Robespierre in the French Revolution, I told you, the Reign of Terror worked. For as bad as it is, it worked. And for as bad as Hitler is, that country went from the abyss, and what did it get to, like 1,072% inflation? I mean, it's just like, extraordinary. They're stacking up trillions and trillions of Deutschmarks, in the grocery stores, just to buy food. I mean, he took them from that to zero unemployment. Soviet Union, zero unemployment. What do you think Roosevelt's New Deal was all patterned after? They looked at Stalin, called him Uncle Joe. What's he doing? He's got zero unemployment. Maybe socialism is the way. It'd be nice if we had a few satellites. We could have seen what they were really doing. But there's a degree to which we have to acknowledge the fact, and that's important because an extraordinarily high percentage of the people who are going to grade your exam are Marxist socialists. Completely, totally, in the tank. So please don't use any language like I've used in class, pointing out that modern-day Marxists don't even bother to read Marx. Hell, we'd all be Marxists if they really had Marx, because that's utopia. I'm for 0% unemployment. I'm for everybody being really rich. Hell, I'd like to drive a Mercedes. And I'd like all of you to be rich too. But what they postulate and what they're doing is Marx would be spinning in his grave like on a DVD drive. It'd be, it's totally, okay. Skipping capitalism is not the best way to socialism, all right? Proof is in the pudding. That's why we study the history. All right, so when we get to this point, all I'm pointing out is that Mussolini and Hitler and Franco were able to do things that the world's democracies were not. Because democracies always are going to be slower, and you've always got contention, and you've always got different ideas, and it moves at a snail's pace, and it's extraordinarily frustrating. But we've always kind of said, since this country was founded, we'd rather let the people decide than put all the power in one person's hands, because that's got a bad track record. Okay? But in this case, those guys that have all the power were able to put their countries back together pretty quickly and move them out of depression much faster than the United States did. We didn't get out of depression until the war actually started. They were out a decade before that. So, that's weird. Kudos to the dictators, okay? In the end, much worse. So, we know that because this is really the destruction of Europe. And I would argue, if I was writing my own essay, to the people that write the damn test, that really we don't need questions from this period on. We should study European history up to 1945. Because after 1945, we're talking about Europe is really on the back burner of world power. Unless you want to make the Soviet Union and put it right in there. But you still have to put the United States as the number one, number two, right there, those two countries. So why do we put so much into this? I really don't know, other than the fact that they just want to emphasize, busting everybody's butt and making sure you're keeping current with your history. Fine. That's fine. Okay? The key, I think, to the Cold War is that the West is going to develop because money was infused into the West to rebuild West Germany and rebuild France and rebuild England and rebuild all that damage in World War II. And Stalin did not want to take Marshall Plan money. That's totally okay. I'm sure we were very happy we didn't give him billions and billions. But at the same time, the East is not going to develop at the same rate as the West. Combine that with command economy and their experiment of kind of like hybrid socialism. And what you end up with, of course, is what we know today. We thought at the time we didn't know, but what you have in 1945, about the 1980s, is you have the West just taking off, rebuilding, startup jobs, mechanization. All the roads in West Germany are like glass. They're just beautiful. It's easy to get places. The trains all run on time. Everything is exactly what you dream of as you go on European holiday today. And then you go into Eastern Europe, and you're in a bit of a time warp. And you still find rubble from World War II. And you still find things that are really worn out, and people that don't have, really, really bad teeth. They have really, really limited choices in shoes, clothing, lifestyle, automobiles. If they even have them, they're still all riding, trains and bicycles, and they're not, they don't have the kind of movement. They don't have the kind of exposure. They don't have the salaries. They don't have the freedom to be able to. West Germany are like glass. They're just beautiful. It's easy to get places. The trains all run on time. Everything is exactly what you dream of as you go on European holiday today. And then you go into Eastern Europe, and you're in a bit of a time warp. And you still find rubble from World War II. And you still find things that are really worn out, and people that don't have, really, really bad teeth. They have really, really limited choices in shoes, clothing, lifestyle, automobiles. If they even have them, they're still all riding, trains and bicycles, and they're not, they don't have the kind of movement. They don't have the kind of exposure. They don't have the salaries. They don't have the freedom to be able to do a lot of the things that's happening in the West. So you have this incredible gap, but the gap is closed by what we call brinksmanship, by fear, by the nuclear age, by the fact that we have to pay attention to North Korea. We can call them crazy today, but we still have to pay attention to them because they have nukes. And for the big part of the Cold War, there's only two players in the nuclear equation. It's the United States and the Soviet Union. And of course, they stole the technology from the United States, and the arms race was on, and that's the heart of this Cold War. And yes, it extends into Asia with Korea, with Vietnam. It extends into the Middle East with the 1967 war and the Yom Kippur War of 1973. It extends into South America. It extends into Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Africa. It extends into Uganda and all over the place. So this continued, and there was this increasing, and that's my story. That's why I studied Russian and majored in it, because there was this just absolute powerful known fear that we could all blow up the world. Something new after World War II is we have the technology to completely vaporize this entire planet and lay waste to it. And then by 1949, you get the Chinese coming in, and they adopt Marxist ideology. Hybrid Marxist ideology. And once Mao is in charge, and they went, and then it's a matter of, well, let's see, by Chinese get the bomb in the mid-60s, late 60s, and then you've got three players you got to figure out with, and you get India and Pakistan and Israel and Great Britain and France, and it's just, and then now North Korea, potentially Iran, and the program gets larger and larger now. But it all spins out of this reality that this relationship between the United States and Soviet Union it got so bad. And they talk about, it got better time and time, and it got worse from time to time. It was bad with Stalin. It was probably at its, probably its low point. Not its greatest danger, though. That will be under Khrushchev. But Khrushchev was really a moderate. He criticized Stalin, and things looked really good for a while. The poor people of Hungary thought that was their ticket to freedom. That got smashed. The poor people of Czechoslovakia thought that was their ticket to freedom later. That got smashed. When Khrushchev is finally discredited after the Cuban Missile Crisis and taking off his shoe at the United Nations, you end up with Leonid Brezhnev, who's very much a Stalinist, hardliner, hard drinker, hard smoker, tough guy, like the big Russian bear, and his Brezhnev doctrine is basically going to just absolutely grind us into Vietnam and continue to grind us until we leave Vietnam in shame and they feel like they've really got something. Brezhnev died, and you have this revolving door in the Soviet Union of, it's like leader du jour, because they keep picking guys from that same generation, and they're in their 70s. Russian men in their 70s are at a premium. Okay, Russian life expectancy for males is around 56 to 58. And that's not because of global warming. That is due to bad vodka and bad cigarettes and too much of both. Women lived to about 70. Men lived to 56. Gee. Wow. So these guys are dropping like flies. I can't even keep up. Andropov, Chernyenko, and then finally they find Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. a young guy in his 50s, doesn't smoke, doesn't drink. Wow. Talk about optimism. And this guy came in and said, yeah, we got some problems. And we're gonna have to identify our problems. And it's something we do probably every hour on the hour. Hey, something's broken, let's fix it. We're always evaluating. Our whole society is like one big Norton utility. We're constantly looking at where our virus is, where are we weak, what are we doing wrong. If you don't do that in the corporate world, you're dead in the water anyway. They had to make it a big government program for the first time since 1917. What's wrong with government? We'll give it a name, glasnost. Find out problem. Nobody's going to come forward because that's how you end up in Siberia making ice cubes. But after a while, after Gorbachev pointed out the obvious things, guess what they did? It actually started to work. They started to actually criticize their government, and he said that we must have glasnost in order to have perestroika, so we can fix the problems and right the ship. That's pretty obvious. That's corporate America every day. The problem was they never got to perestroika. The whole foundation was built on sand. They couldn't fix it. It was too far gone. And for the first time that I can ever recall in studying anything Russian, in 1991, there is a major transformation of power in Russia, and millions of people didn't die. It's amazing. They finally found a way to not kill huge numbers of people. Of course, they're only going to count 3 or 4 of them, but not kill huge. It's relatively nonviolent, very, very nonviolent. Gorbachev will ultimately be discredited, and he's pretty much hated by the Russians today because he's seen as weak, but he was probably in the wrong place, the wrong time. But he had extraordinary vision, and I think his heart was in the right place. But once he realized the road the Soviet Union was going down, too late. They lost grip on Western Europe. They began losing grip everywhere else, and their own satellite states in Ukraine started going, independent, and everything just started to unravel. And the guy who comes up is Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin's interesting because Yeltsin's heavy drinker, but also relatively intelligent and pretty open-minded. He was kind of a maverick in the Duma, and Yeltsin opened up. My favorite thing about Yeltsin is he opened up the archive that has now been closed by Mr. Spooky Dude Putin, and we can't get any more Russian history because the archive is sealed once again. Brief little wrinkle in time, 1991 to about 1995. Russian scholars were headed to Moscow, they're headed to St. Petersburg, and they're finding all the dirt on Stalin. They're finding out, that crazy guy Joe McCarthy wasn't so crazy after all. There were a lot of Russian-paid KGB informants in Hollywood and in Washington at the time of the Second Red Scare. We learned a lot during this time of the Commonwealth of Independent States and Boris Yeltsin. Since then, of course, things have changed dramatically, and that's because the West adopted a common currency, but I don't think that was at all to offend the Russians or cause problems or drive the ruble into further weakness than it already is. I think that was an effort to try to compete with Russia and with Asia and the United States. The euro is a European dollar, and the idea of the euro was to try to get Europe into some kind of normalcy. And if any of you had ever traveled, you guys are probably too young, but if you ever travel across Europe in the 1980s and 1990s, you had to have a pocket full. You had to have every pocket with every different currency you could think of because the countries are so close. I think I told you guys a story. I skied to 3 countries in one day, and I had Swiss francs in one pocket, I had German marks in one, and I had Austrian shillings in the other. And every time we'd go into a little chalet, we had to figure out where the heck we were, and we know what country we're in because they're only accepting shillings. And I think, okay, what pocket is that? Okay, so this one. I can only get a hot dog here. A sausage. And the idea was that the euro simplified a lot of things. The Swiss never got in, neither did the British, because the pound sterling and the Swiss franc are too strong, and it's not in their best interest to do so, and they won't. But this led to kind of more and more countries saying, hey, we want to be in euro also. The Hungarians want euros. They want to get rid of their currency. The Poles want to get rid of the zloty. And more countries started joining and wanting to get membership into the European Economic Community, further alienating the Russians, because along with Euro membership is the opportunity to join NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was the fist. It was always, well, maybe fist isn't good. Maybe the finger going boop, boop, poking Stalin in the eye in the 1940s and 50s that they had to farm the Warsaw Pact to kind of check NATO. And NATO today, we talk about the problems in Ukraine. Putin actually makes a lot of sense with his Ukrainian policy because he can't afford to let Ukraine go into NATO because that would be a real mess. So, see you, Nikki. Take care. Okay, so I don't think they would ask anything this current.
They probably will, honestly.
And because it's the last year of this format of the test, I just don't see it. So I don't see a reason to trudge any farther forward in history. Is there anything that anybody else wants clarification on or wants to talk about? This is it. It's about controlling the variables you have control over now. Your rest, your diet. Remember, plenty of writing utensils, extra pens, black and blue, ink only, pencils, separate erasers, timepiece in cases of power failure, because you'll keep testing, okay, in natural light, okay? So have a timepiece, not on your phone, got to be a timepiece. Make sure you have all your I's dotted and T's crossed, okay? All right. Good night's sleep. Go get 'em. I'd like to say have fun, but I don't think that's appropriate.
Lucy and Jacob and I might drop by around 10:30-ish. I think that's 4-5.
Yeah.
Because we're probably gonna be heading over to WEC around then, so we might just ask like
Sure.
DVQ.
See you, Tom. Take care, buddy. Yeah.
Just get a couple final
Yeah. Anything.
questions.
Anything you need. You got it. Can I sign it for you, Eleanor?
Yes, please. Yeah, just wherever.
She doesn't trust me to vouch for her.
No, I just want to make sure I have everything.
Well done. Are you going to take the test tomorrow?
Yes.
You are. Good for you.